Welcome to UNE's One Night Teach-In on Climate Change and Justice. I'm Montana Stevens, a Senior Marine Affairs major with Writing and Communication minors. I will be your moderator for this evening's panel on communicating climate change. Communicating climate change is one of the most important topics that we can talk about tonight because it's how we transfer information and figure out what is going on in the environment in coastal communities and basically everywhere on Earth. So let's move on to how this portion of the teaching will work. It will be similar to the previous session if you all attended one of those breakouts. Each panelist will speak for 5 minutes, and once they are all done, we will open it up for any questions and discussion with everyone here. Now let me properly introduce our panel. First speaking will be Megan Grumbling, M.A. Developmental Writing Specialist, Student Academic Success Center here at UNE. And then we'll have Stephen Burt, B.F.A, M.F.A, Associate Professor of Art here at UNE. And then Dr. Matthew Anderson, Ph.D, Professor of English here at UNE. And then we'll have Sonya Durney, M.L.I.S, Scholarly Communication Research and Teaching Librarian here at UNE. And then finally, we have Heather Dwyer, Sadlier, Education Doctorate, Associate Professor, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Educator of School of Professional Programs here at UNE. And with that, Megan, if you would please start us off.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah? Close. Yeah. Go very close. Okay, these are my slides. Hi, everybody, and I'm here today to talk about story and eco-story and how story in the forms of fiction, poetry, and theater, as well as other things like films, operas, memoirs, puppet shows, all kinds of forms of story can help us meet the climate crisis. So first, story can help us in telling truth. Because as we all know, the truth of this crisis is really hard and overwhelming, and there's a lot to take in. It can be really hard for us to reckon with it head on. And so luckily for us, we have story. We have long had story to help us reckon with it. Story offers us a place where we can grapple with the difficult truths about climate and where we can practice how to face this crisis, how to wrap our heads around it, how to feel about it, and how to tell it, as well as how to act on it, how to imagine alternatives and solutions and put those into action. Story is a realm of the imagination and the senses, and it is also a mediated realm in that it's a place where we can consider all these difficult truths about climate through characters who are not ourselves, through metaphor and allegory and myth. So, for example, the people in that picture right there are grappling with climate crisis in an opera that retells the ancient Persephone myth, and they're trying to figure out what to do about it. Another type of story might zoom out to a science fiction future to imagine how the consequences of our actions play out down the road, or to imagine alternatives and possibilities and solutions to solving the problems that we now face. We need to recognize that not all of the stories that we have and have long had are stories for good. And in fact, we have a long legacy of a lot of stories that have not been helpful, have been really harmful. Many of the stories in our legacy have depicted nature as other, as separate, as uninhabited, as a commodity. Many of our stories have presented other beings and other human beings as separate, as savage, as lesser, as something to be dominated, as something to be commodified, as something to be destroyed even. However, we get to choose the stories that we tell, and we have to choose the stories that we tell. We get to choose our stories and reassess our stories, discard the ones or adapt the ones that are not serving the good. We can and we have to retell the stories that help the good and create new stories that reflect the truth of this world and how we want to exist in it. And we can do that. So Story can also help us meet the crisis of climate through telling kinship. So story is this magical thing that activates our senses, our emotions, and our empathy. So it's so powerful in that respect. And in doing so, it activates our sense of connection and our sense of belonging. And in that way, story can expand our sense of who our community actually is. Who can we relate to? Who can we care about? Who can we work to take care of? Who do we care enough to take care of? We can use story to help expand our sense of who we are. Story can bring us into the experience of humans who have had different lives than us, different beliefs than us, live in different places than us, different histories than us, or into the experience of future humans who will come after us and have to deal with everything, or into the experience of other species than ourselves, into the life of a small mollusk or a tall old tree, so that we can better understand and so better care about and so care for all of them. Story so can help us grow who we consider to be part of we when we talk about we and we tell ourselves forward. And finally, story can help us in telling joy, which we all need lots of. Because as we know, there are so many horrors as part of this crisis, and we look at them all the time. I'm sure everybody in this room is looking at them in all of your classes all the time, and it is so much, and we have to face them. We have to face these facts. But when we are facing only the horrors, we can get, as I'm sure you know, exhausted, catatonic. We might want to go back to bed, have another drink, stop trying. And after a while, the horrors are not motivating for us in a psychologically sustainable way. What can motivate us more sustainably are hope and beauty, pleasure, wonder, possibility, love, and joy. And stories and poems and puppet shows and operas, these can help remind us how to find these things. They can remind us of the beauty of a snowy egret in a green marsh in the afternoon, or how wondrous the little green leaves unfold each spring, just like magic. Story can stir our gratitude, our curiosity, and our sense of the possible. And all of those things neurologically make us more capable of change, adaptation, and creativity in addressing the crisis we're in. So I leave you with these two quotes here from two master storytellers from the Kentucky farmer poet Wendell Berry. I don't know if you can read those all the way away, but he says, laugh. Laughter is immeasurable. Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts. We need to consider all the facts, but we also need to find our joy to act. And from the writer and activist, who is Laguna Pueblo, Paula Ben Allen, you can't walk in beauty if you don't laugh and have a good time. If you want the planet to get well, then you have to get happy. And story can help us do that too. So just to conclude, poems, films, operas, memoirs, puppet shows, all that stuff, they can help us grapple with our reality in this crisis. They can help us connect with each other across communities and across the biosphere even. And they can remind us of all the beauty that there is out there for us to care for and work for together. Thank
you. Contrary to popular belief, dragons do exist. They're everywhere around us, and most of the time we want to ignore them. So this project was really an exploration of uncovering those dragons and thinking about them and putting them out there in a way that was disturbing even to myself at times when I was making them. Like, I made that artwork. It's kind of disturbing. So this is the first slide here. It's late. Dragon of late stage capitalism. If you've done a little studying, you know that we are in a terrible state, and a lot of that is due to the unhinged resource consumption of capitalism. And so I wanted to make an image that would just keep revealing, keep giving to you the more you look at it. Also be slightly funny, but also really dark at the same time. That's late stage capitalism. These dragons are just plaguing me. I think about them all the time. You probably do too, in a different form. You're like climate change, flooding, wars, or we're on the edge of World War III perhaps. And we all have to think about that every day. So some humor is also used. Let's see what's next. Fields of Harvest, the Dragon of Pestilence. We're all well aware of that. And I wanted to make some image that sort of revealed that. It was dark and also is strange enough that it was a little bit palatable. The real thing isn't. But in this case, it becomes a little bit more palatable, I hope, at the same time, strange. Dragon of fossil fuels. We consume fossil fuels all the time when we don't think about the impact. We're like, I'm going to go for a drive. Well, you're putting tons of carbon into the atmosphere every time you do that, every time you go to the store, every time you're a single driver. And again, we don't really think about the results of that. So this image was to really make it manifest of like what you're actually doing and what the fossil fuel industry is actually doing. So think about it. That's this image. I really had hoped when I started this series that it would just go away, that I could make a few images, and the more images I made, the more important it seemed to be to make even more of it to address this issue. And crimes against humanity, the murder of nature is really, that's a class issue, that's a race issue, that's an inequality issue. And we have people in corporations all over the world that are literally destroying nature every day. And that's in our community here too. And we take it for granted. Well, that's progress, that's personal right. You have a piece of land, you should be able to cut down every tree. But who speaks for the animals? Who speaks for everybody else who wants that green space? I think there's one more. And then the worst one maybe is something's happening here. It's climate change, right? And I wanted to make that a kind of scary image that encapsulated a lot of the fears that I have. This series went on to make, I think, like 23 different images of dragons. And trying to use artwork to address these things on a personal level is important to me, but also it's been very important to try to communicate that to others. So anybody who wants to borrow these images and send them out, they're welcome. They were intended, the reason they're on ledger paper is because I wanted them to be anti-art, sort of a Dada-esque, like it's not meant to be pretty, it's meant to be important, it's meant to ask you to pay attention. And that's that.
All right. All right, ready, set, go. So, yes, I'm Matthew Anderson from the English department, and I'm going to say a few things about poetry. And as soon as you say the word poetry, people are just going to shut down. Oh, God, the least accessible. When we read it in high school, I didn't get it. I don't know how to talk about it. And so if I could do anything, it would be to say that there are all different kinds of poetry, and that it's a big, vast world, and that there has been no more exciting time to be alive in terms of poetry than the last 50 years in the United States. Poetry has speciated here in the most kind of florid, marvelous, magical way. So if you like coral reefs, or diversity and the miracle of life, poetry is your world right now. So this is not about the poem, although I like poems that are kind of like the poem. That's where I live. But there's just a huge, huge world of poetry out there. And there's a place for you where you'll connect. And I'll say you already have a lived relationship with poetry. You love music. I could ask you, what has music meant to you over the last 4, 5, 6 years of your life? My guess is you'd say something like, it's what's helped keep me alive. It's sustained me. It's been a refuge. It's a place where I felt understood and connected and alive, and I had hope, and it helped me sort of get through some difficult experiences. I could spell it out, but you know what those experiences can be, and where this is, so poetry originally is all literature in the past was poetry. It was dramatic, it was plays, it was epics, long, narratives, where it was lyric poetry. Lyric poem is a poem that gives voice to the expressions or feelings of a person. And that was called lyric poetry because it was originally accompanied by the lyre. Poetry was sung. And so you're very much there with poetry already. So we'll just say and do that. And I want to say a couple other things, building on what has already been said, that it is very much about feeling. The fancy word for the study of beauty is aesthetics. Philosophy aesthetics. How's that different from being aesthetic and shut down? But it comes from the Greek word aesthesis, which means feeling. And so it's above all something that we feel. And with that music and those songs that I would say, I don't want to say make the case for poetry, but to describe what it is and how it's different from novels or plays in some ways, is that it is untranslatable. The form is inseparable from the content. And it provides, for me, it's a way of speaking and saying truths that can't be said otherwise. And that irreducible singularity is important. And if I had to make the case for it right now, say we're living at a time where that's particularly important because we're living in a country in which we have radically different, non-reconcilable ideas of truth. We do not agree on what truth is. So you have an either or, and poetry can offer a third way, which is a form of truth that is not accessible otherwise. That's a lot of big claims, right? I want to make sure, a minute and a half left, so I want to make sure that I read the poem. But I would say this, as with all literature, it can make me feel like I'm in community, which is really important. We're talking about building solidarities for mobilizing political action. It can make me feel a connection to other people, sort of from the inside, their soul. That's going to be really important because people are going to be dying not only from hurricanes and floods, but from war. That's where most of the dying is going to happen. Because when 150 million people in Bangladesh are underwater and they need somewhere to go, they're going to be knocking on the door of India. When water runs scarce, the big wars in our century are going to be fought over water. That's what the Pentagon's planning for. It'd be great if we were planning for peace too. But if we connect with people who we view as radically other, the possibility for compassion and cooperation increases. And the last thing I'd say is kind of on a personal, spiritual, existential level, when I get depressed and there's despair. Poetry, like literature, lets me, if you can read, you'll never be alone again in your life. I know that somebody else has been where I am, has felt what I'm feeling right now. And that's enormously hopeful and important when we're talking about sustaining and nourishing ourselves in the face of real challenges and feelings of hopelessness at times. So I just want to say there's this great volume of Ecopoetry, which is a whole world of different kinds of poems. I'd encourage you to buy it. My wife gave it to me. And I would encourage you to read one poem at random. Don't worry about going start to finish. Don't worry if you get it. Just flip through it. I read a poem a day. That's kind of my digestive pace. Yeah, and I know Steve reads a poem before every class. And the other thing I need to say before I say anything more on the 5 minutes, 17-second mark, is that Megan didn't tell you that she is a poet, an award-winning poet, and that her most recent collection is in the Anthropocene. And I'll let Megan maybe afterwards tell us a little bit more what that is about, but it's very much about imagining, anticipating, and trying to sort of make sense of, from the other side, this environmental crisis, apocalypse. So I'm going to read a poem by Mary Oliver, whose relationship with nature is kind of romantic in a certain way. And so the mood will be kind of calm and tranquil and serene and have a sense of beauty and wonder. And here I'm telling you what you should feel. So there we go. It's called Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to have let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things.
Great, thank you. Thank you for letting me join you remotely. So invite a librarian to any gathering, and we're likely to talk about information literacy. So I'm here tonight to talk about how I feel information literacy and climate literacy are part of the solution to our climate crisis. Of course, they're not the entire solution, but I do believe 100% that folks having access to credible information is part of the solution. So let me start just by defining those terms. Information literacy, many of us have heard that term before. It's basically the how information works. So understanding where to find information, how to process that information, how to communicate that information as we're talking about tonight, and how to ethically share that information. The term climate literacy, on the other hand, isn't quite as well known in conversation. So let me just take a moment to actually go ahead and read the definition of climate literacy. So climate literacy is an understanding of your influence on climate and climate's influence on you and society. A climate literate person understands the essential principles of Earth's climate system, knows how to assess the scientifically credible information about climate, communicates about climate and climate change in a meaningful way, and is able to make informed and responsible decisions with regard to action that may affect the climate. So I like that it sort of moves from understanding to action in that definition. And I also apologize, you just got to hear a really wonderful poem and look at some artwork, and now I'm reading definitions of climate literacy for you. So one last note on literacy is I just want to note that there's all sorts of different literacies, right? We hear about these, but they're all really interwoven and support each other. So it's also important that we ourselves, our students, our society have science literacy, digital literacy, media literacy, health literacy. They're all really tied together. Next, I just sort of want to talk about and spend the rest of my time talking about some really common barriers that I see to climate literacy and some things that we can hopefully do to overcome those. So the common barriers that come to mind for me are misinformation, inequitable access to information, and censorship. So let's start with misinformation. So misinformation or false information is often spread widely regardless of intent, right? Some folks are spreading this information mistakenly, they just don't know better, and other people are doing it in a more devious fashion. This has always been around since the start of information, the start of sharing information, but what's really made it a bigger problem in recent years is social media has really allowed this to further spread, blatant lies. A 2016 study found that the most shared article on social media in that year was an article claiming that climate change is a hoax. So that was the most shared article of the entire year. So my first thing I would suggest is to think before you share any information, right? And also at the same time as this rise in information, we're seeing a decline in journalism. So newsrooms are closing despite the need for really good quality news. Since about 2004, 1,800 newspapers in the United States have closed. That's a lot of newspapers. So another thing we can do is to support our local newspapers, whether that means subscribing if we're able to the papers that we read, or giving to their annual funds. However we can support our local newspapers, this information is really important for our communities. My next point as a barrier is inequitable access to information. So as we all know, climate change research is really fast moving, it's interdisciplinary, and the folks solving these problems need access to the most up-to-date information. But a problem is that a lot of information is behind paywalls. So you need to have a subscription or access to these scientific databases to get to this information. So that's really a problem. One thing we can think about as researchers and for the scientists out there and the authors is to consider publishing open access. When you publish your information open access, that is providing equitable access. And it has lots of benefits besides getting the information to these folks. There's also, academic citation advantages. You're more likely to get cited further. And your research is really going to have better general impact. Some studies have shown that open access articles are much more frequently cited in online news sources. They're more frequently cited in Twitter feeds. The data shows up more often in policy documents because the folks creating this content are not academic. So they're not in these academic databases behind the paywalls finding the research. It's also known to me that many scientists don't want to be seen as activists. They're worried about their reputation and want to maintain their objectivity, just like librarians traditionally have been very concerned with maintaining our neutrality. But there are some things you can do, even as a scientist, to sort of get your thoughts out there. So one thing I've seen more and more in looking at studies is folks are adding an additional abstract to your paper. So you have your traditional abstract, and then people are also adding an easy to read and plain language abstract to scientific papers. Again, this really makes it easier for policymakers, folks, journalists, and other folks who are not scientists to understand what those papers are conveying. So those easy to read abstracts, and also more and more papers are starting to include a policy statement or even creating policy briefs for stakeholders out of your research. So those are some things we can think about as authors and researchers and scientists. Another barrier I see to climate literacy is the huge amount of censorship happening in our country. We are seeing unprecedented numbers of books being banned across the country. I'm sure everyone's reading this in the newspaper. And again, this has always happened. Just like misinformation, this has always happened, but it's happening now in unprecedented numbers. And what's even more concerning is rather than sort of local discussions between school boards and parents, it often has a legislative overview on this. So there's laws being passed overriding local control over what books can be in classrooms. And this is really going to impact the critical literacy skills of our students. So this is important. And we're also seeing censorship of information. So for instance, there's a law in North Carolina that limits the government agencies from using they can only use historical data on sea level rise. So they can't look at any new science or any new data. And this is a law. So this is concerning to me, the censorship of books and information. So again, with what can we do? I just, would ask everyone to follow legislation. If you see something happening in your community, write a letter, follow what's going on, go to your town meetings. This is really important, and support your local libraries. If you see these book censorship issues coming up, it's really important to, as a citizen, to speak up and say something. And then the last point I want to make as a barrier to climate literacy is that there's often a lack of consistent instruction about information literacy, media literacy, and climate literacy across the student experience. This is in all schools. So it's great here at UNE that I know we've just revamped our new undergraduate curriculum, and information literacy is now listed as a core tenet there. So I think there's lots of work for us to do on campus, and I'm really excited about it. So I invite everyone, whether you're a student or a faculty member, to reach out to us at the library. We'd love to help you think of assignments that you can use in your classes that highlight information literacy. We're happy to talk to you about publishing, open access, or other ways, or any of these things I mentioned. So for that, I will pass it along to my colleague, Heather. So thank you.
So I'm speaking about unequal impacts of climate change. And I would imagine that you are aware of some of them and some of the other events you attended tonight. But climate change inequality manifests in many forms. Certain communities are particularly susceptible to rising sea levels, while others face heightened risk from severe storms and drought. Location is a primary determinant of a community's or individual's vulnerability to climate change impacts, but it is not the only determinant. Income levels also dictate whether individuals or communities can afford costly adaptations, for example, air conditioning, fire and flood insurance, or community solar and wind farms that can minimize the consequences of climate change. In many instances, those two factors, location and income, work together. Some of the most climate-affected communities are also the least financially equipped to adapt. As a result, climate change is projected to dramatically increase global inequality, with one study estimating that average incomes in the poorest countries will decline by 75% by the year 2100, while incomes in some of the richest countries will continue to grow. As we are all aware, climate change is a global problem. affecting everyone. However, its consequences are not evenly distributed around the world. For example, although average global temperatures are projected to rise by 3 degrees centigrade by 2100, some locations along the equator have already warmed twice as much, leading to increased rates of drought. So how does location and income determine the impacts of climate change on people? The following slides provide a quick overview of how one consequence of climate change, heat waves, impacts 2 people living in separate locations with different income levels, and therefore different opportunities for making adaptations. As a result, they experience the effects of rising temperatures in strikingly different ways. So the gentleman on the left has some of the advantages of income and location, and the gentleman on the right does not. Heat waves cause the air to become more stagnant, which worsens pollution and leads to significant health problems. In the coming decades, air pollution is projected to worsen as heat waves become more frequent. One of the main ways to combat heat waves is to use cooling sources like air conditioning. However, only 8% of the 2.8 billion people living in the world's hottest places had access to air conditioning in 2018. By 2050, demand for air conditioning in developing countries will be 5 times what it is today. Heat causes people to slow down, decreasing their productivity. In the United States, researchers found that workers were up to 28% less productive in hotter weather. And for us educators, heat significantly impedes school performance. One study found that students perform about 14% worse when taking an exam on a 90-degree day compared to a 72-degree day. One of my jobs in the education department is to go observe student teachers. And I was observing one of my student teachers. They're all rock stars with really cute little second graders in one school system. And it was wonderful, high ceilings, lots of air conditioning, all good. Then I went 2 zip codes away to another school, also great student teacher, also great other faculty in the building, also cute kids, and it was sweltering. So kids, obviously weren't able to do as much work as the ones in the first school. It is vital that we understand how location and income determine the opportunities that individuals, communities, and countries have to make adaptations that mitigate the impacts of climate change. And I brought a friend along. I'm not going to play. Oh, no. Oh, I'm going to recommend you go listen to everything Greta Thunberg has said. But most of you probably know this young woman. She's a Swedish environmental activist who has been dedicated to speaking up about the climate crisis since she was 15 years old. She started before some of us, not you. She's now 19 and still going strong. She has spoken at the UN Climate Action Summit and climate conventions in Stockholm, Helsinki, Brussels, and London. She was the youngest ever Time Magazine Person of the Year. I recommend that you watch everything she's on YouTube that she says. She is known for challenging world leaders to take immediate action for climate change mitigation. But she is challenging each of us as well, especially those of us who have those advantages of living in locations where we get to breathe clean air and enjoy cooling breezes, along with sufficient income so that we can have nutritious food and clear water and other healthful options. We who have these advantages must answer Greta's challenge and engage in actions that mitigate the impacts of climate change for those who lack these opportunities. And quoting our friend Greta, once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So instead of looking for hope, look for action. Then and only then, hope will come. And since I'm with a bunch of artists, and what's the one up there? This is a hopeful sign that you may have seen around Portland by a main sculpture, light sculpture by Charlie Hewitt. So artists are important in this whole message that we give. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here and sharing how important communicating about climate change is. At this time, we will now open it up for a few questions and comments, and feel free to address the entire panel or one in particular, or even ask a question to the audience.
Okay. So my question was addressed more to like the creative arts professors that are here with us today. And it was basically, why do you think that climate change art or like creative literature around climate change is not as common or well known as other forms of climate change communication? Because up until this point, I feel like I haven't really seen that much. I mean, I'm more of a science major, so my focus is more over there, but I feel like even in what I've done, I haven't seen too much of creative literature.
Thank you for your question. I'm not sure I know the answer, besides the fact that we do tend to silo our areas of knowledge and what we work in. And I feel like I've seen more interdisciplinary work in the last few years, science coming together with art, coming together with literature. And I think we really need it. I mean, I think what you're saying is really identifying a need that we need more and more of this, of all of these, an ecology of these disciplines, talking together and helping each other out, because no one of them can do it alone. So I don't know why, other than the just sort of traditional siloing of the disciplines, but I do think there's hope. And I think that I've seen a lot more. We have a very interdisciplinary program right here at University of New England. So, and I think that there's more of that happening. I think artists and scientists and communicators of all kinds are sort of hungry for that, for talking to each other and working together and trying to just grapple with this, because we all care about it and we all have different ways of thinking about it and different ways of approaching it. And I'm seeing just in my circles more and more of a hunger to do so.
I also think a lot of people want their art to just be pleasant and to be marketable, and sometimes art dealing with climate change is dealing with unpleasant truths, and so it's not as saleable as other art. So I think there's a capitalist sort of overtone to the whole thing. The art market right now is fairly disgusting at the high end in terms of what's selling and why it's selling and how it's selling, and so I do think that that's a big part of it.
Just really quickly, I sort of want to bounce it back to Megan Grumbling. Where are all the poets writing about the environment and environmental crisis, and with imagination and maybe offering us a way to imagine a different possible future, but in a very challenging way. I mean that in a good way. So Megan can tell you about her book. Read Megan's book. And I'd also add that, so when when this book came out, there was an exhibit over at the library. Painters who painted who were inspired by her poems. And usually the relationship goes in the other direction. You have poets writing about paintings. But that kind of, that kind of pairing can be particularly useful if we're thinking about sort of, we want art to maybe just communicate directly, realistically, immediately with kind of what's trying to be said, what we're trying to say. And this establishes connections with other, not just with thought, but with other dimensions of feeling. And there's a space that's opened up there that's really important. But I want to turn it around and just ask you, don't have to answer it now. What would you make? What would you make? Do it. It could be a song that might sustain. The other question I have, and I'll shut up, would be, okay, we got how many people in this room? What do you think we could do together? What do you think we could do together? A hell of a lot, right? I mean, you get these computers, just think what we can do. You guys know, we can do a lot right here. And I just think sort of the poetry piece might be, we're getting together, trying to lift our spirits. It doesn't have to be a poem we're going to read. In Russia, they know poems off October by heart, and they recite them, drinking and everything. But it could be a song. It could be Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, it could be Lil Dicky, I don't know, whatever. There's a poem that every song everybody tells me to listen to that I haven't listened to yet. Anyhow, yeah, there we go.
You can write
a group poem, yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to say how much more accessible art is than prose and than scientific articles or texts. So art is much more inviting, and we I think feel that we can get into it. There are many more entry points to art. That's what.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for the same reason that I know a lot of historians I work with really aren't reading from history textbooks anymore. They're all reading historical fiction because it's a lot easier way to kind of get into it. And similarly, if you're trying to raise consciousness and mobilize people for environmental action, the amount of suffering is so overwhelming that you're just going to shut down. And a poem or a song or a painting can allow me to connect with one person, and that can be the gateway. That can be managed, and it can give me access to that feeling in a way that can really kind of be moving and effective. So, yeah.
Do you want this one?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
So, mine's not really a question, but more of a comment. I will say that I did end up reading Megan Grumbling's work for Anderson's class, actually, and it was absolutely amazing. So as a student, I highly recommend reading it. It's very inspiring, it's very well written, and it's very clever. I very much like it. As a person who loves like the Persephone story in general, absolutely loved it. And I also really wanted to comment, Professor Burt, your dragons, looking in depth about them, it's like, it's beautiful, but it's also terrifying at the same time. And I really appreciate seeing that kind of art. It's definitely one of those things that makes me happy to see, of people taking the things that inspire them, taking the things that they see in their mind and using it to try and educate and sort of show off to the public the things that we should be nervous about and we should be scared about. And like, I feel like your art made it look very scary, which is great. That's what we want. So I just wanted to let you guys know that it was really cool.
Part of the inspiration of that was the great artist John Hartfield, who worked in World War II and did a lot of anti-Nazi art. And they were scary images. And I thought, if I can even get close to that, then I'll be doing something good. And that's where the dragons started right there.
We've been talking about Megan Grumbling's book. I would now like to ask Megan if she could tell us a little bit about what these poems are about. Please, Megan.
Okay. Yeah, for those of you that don't know, the Persephone myth is a really old Greek myth that tells the story of why we have seasons, basically. So Persephone, goddess of springtime. Her mother is the goddess of harvest, Demeter. And so Persephone in the original myth is either seduced or abducted underground. And while she's gone, her mother Demeter shuts down the productive earth, and there is no harvest, there's no crops. And so hence winter. And so in the late Anthropocene, Persephone comes and goes erratically between worlds. She drinks too much. She takes a human lover instead of remaining wed to the god of death. And a human chorus sort of watches, enables, and deals with the fallout, which is pretty, I guess, kind of bad. But they turn it around at the end. So it's a retelling of the ancient myth.
Could I just ask, the Anthropocene, some of us may not know what that is. Everybody may not be the only one. But what is the Anthropocene?
The Anthropocene is a term that has been adopted to talk about the period of geological history defined by human impact. The humans have impacted what we are living right now.
All right, I know that was short. I'm gonna close things up. Thank you all for your questions and comments. We've come to the end of our hour. Thank you, panelists, and if you will join me in thanking them.